Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Have a Life Teaching podcast, where I hope you get some great ideas for your teaching. If you're a leader, some wonderful opportunities to explore how to increase the capabilities of the teachers in your building, and even just getting a sense of what's going on in education these days. So speaking of that, we know that a 21st century educator is all about meeting students where the student is at. Now, many of us might recall our own learning journeys where we sat in rows and we listened to the teacher lecture. But thankfully, although there's always an opportunity to do a mini lesson, thankfully, most teachers, most educators realize we do need to meet the students where the student is at, as I was saying before. And that could mean many things. That could mean bringing in student interests, bringing in student cultural background. It could also mean bringing in creativity when we talk about teaching and learning. And this is why I'm really excited to have my next guest joining us on the podcast. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce Mariah Rankine-Landers, who is co-founder and CEO of Studio Pathways in Oakland, California. And she's got a great new book that just came out titled, Do Your Lessons Love Your Students? So I thought she'd be a great guest to have on the show to really get at how we can meet our students where our students are at, how we can bring in particular, culturally relevant pedagogy. And what does that mean? And how does that tie into creativity? So with that said, Mariah, welcome to the show.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad, like I said, to have you. So Mariah, I like to ask my guests right from the start how you got involved in education and how did culturally relevant pedagogy become your area of focus within education?
It's a long story. Where do we start? I like to tell folks sometimes that I actually did not want to get into teaching. I wanted to study the arts. So I began my college career, lots of art classes. And I also studied cultural anthropology and medical anthropology. I really was interested in the arts. My family didn't support me having a career in the arts. So that moved me into cultural anthropology and medical anthro. And I loved those studies so much. And when I left college, I come from a family of teachers, and the thing that I knew very well to my bones was teaching. And I knew how to get into teaching. I knew how to start the process of becoming a teacher very well. I substitute taught for a year, and then I got into a credentialing program and became a teacher. And then I was like, it's only going to be for 5 years. 5 years. And then I'm going to go back to the art or go back to some medical anthro thing. And it turns out I've stayed here. And what I've recently learned is that, and that's because I fell in love with teaching. So let me be clear. Absolutely love the life of being a teacher. But I also learned that my family, the lineage is so big in my family that there was a state award given to my family in Michigan for having the most set of teachers generation after generation after generation. I was like, oh my gosh, no one ever told me that award happened like in the mid-century. No one ever told me that. I was like, it's been unavoidable, right? That I'm in this family of teachers, unavoidable that I am too a teacher. So I feel like I'm following up and closing up a circle of lots of beautiful teaching and learning through the course of my family history.
Nice. So, how did you go from this, becoming a teacher, being steeped in this teacher culture, and how did your focus turn to? I mean, it makes sense why your focus is about integrating arts
Mhm.
into teaching and learning, but why culturally relevant pedagogy? And what is it specifically for our listeners? And again, how did you find that to be your calling specifically within education?
Sure. In my teaching credentialing program, there was a moment when we were being taught how to introduce books. And the books that they were bringing forward, that our teachers were bringing forward, were all books that had characters that were white, were little white children. And there were three of us that were people of color in that class of 30 in our little cohort. And I just remember looking at Felicia, and Felicia was looking at me, and we were like, not one single book has been introduced yet, not one, that is of a person of color as the main character. And so we pushed back in that class and said, there's a problem here. You can't just read these books that are offering no perspective on anybody else's presence on the planet. And that really kind of firmed up, the experiences that I had as a Black child in school. When you're learning about teaching and learning, you often are drawing on the memories of your own practice or your own experiences, right? So as I would recall stuff, I'd be like, oh yeah, that moment that I remember being a little girl in the back, raising their hand, I'm super smart, and no one ever called on me. Like I was also pretty shy, but when a shy girl raises their hand, call on them. This is a structural racism in place. These are the biases that are in place. I started just really putting the pieces all together around how the state of education was designed. And then I also got my credential at the time that No Child Left Behind entered the scene. And when No Child Left Behind entered the scene, it said, let's take away all of the beautiful parts of teaching and learning and stay focused on, you're going to read, you're going to do some math. Accountability. Part of my student teaching was the experience of teaching from a book, so scripted curriculum, and I just had to read from this script and teach children how to do math, and then ELA, and that was the solid day.
Yeah.
It was miserable, and it just felt like completely unfair. And I was working with largely students of color and had the opportunity to go see other schools where the demographics were changed, where the demographics were flipped, and they were largely white children. And those children were getting this very holistic education and getting what felt very vibrant, what felt easeful on the body. I just went into a state of reaction of, this can't be what
Right.
education is. Surely it cannot. That's a little bit of how I began the whole process. But I've always been someone that has been focused on, how are we responding to each other? How are we responding to the students in our classrooms? And what is this larger picture? Like, what are we actually doing together on this planet? So I tend to think largely in scope. I tend to think collectively. And so my mind kind of always goes in that direction before it kind of narrows in on like a particular idea. But I was seeing a picture where it felt and was uneven and didn't feel like we were creating a more human place to be,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of collectively raising children together for the future. And that was 20 years ago. So
I
I've
mean,
always been on this track.
yeah, you said so much there. Well, I will say this. If I
Mhm.
haven't had an episode yet, I don't think I've had an episode yet, but I will in the future, about how to engage students and
Mhm.
how to not only pick volunteers. So even in my
Yes.
coaching work, I work with teachers constantly on how we get all students participating and responding. So hopefully there won't be any more students like the experience you had, where you were raising your hand in the back and nobody was calling it. So I just wanted to say that those days are numbered. Hopefully, at
Those
least
days are numbered.
work with me. Now, I totally agree. How do we make education vibrant, particularly for students who have been underrepresented, who have been treated in a more rote manner, like you mentioned? How do you change the paradigm or shift the paradigm for traditionally marginalized students through your work at Studio Pathways in particular?
Our main focus is supporting teachers to have the shifts or the transformation process that is going to support them in having permission to go against the grain, what feels like going against the grain, because we've been taught so well how to do things by the rules and what is supposedly good for children. But if we look at right now, the crisis in reading instruction, we've been told it was one thing all along, and then discover, oops, no, that's not what the science ever said. So we learn things, we apply them, we follow them because we think that that's the best thing. But what I want teachers to do is to push outside of those boundaries even more and say, let's respond to the whole way that we are human on this planet. And what does that mean? And let's do some work around what it feels like to spend a day in a classroom. If you think about all of the time that you have with children in a school year, we don't want school to be these drab places, right? That's not what feeds our soul or spirit. We want school to be enlivening places and places that are worthy of us spending our time, because I think time is precious as well. And so I want to make sure that we're also responsive to everybody's time on this planet. To get down to the nitty gritty, I told you I'm a big thinker first.
I love it. Hey, I have lots of different folks on the podcast. I love it.
Yeah. So with Studio Pathways, we do professional development work that is supporting doing the work of looking at positionality. So what are the things that grew you into being? Who are you on this planet? Again, what is your orientation? And when we check our orientation, we are sitting within a US context. And so I'm having folks really understand the US context that they have grown up in. So we're doing the work of looking at the caste system, looking at where we fall within these systems, how these systems have designed our experiences as teachers and our experiences in teaching and learning, and then have designed the expectations that we have for students. So doing that personal work, which is always, the first way in, and then looking at how does the curriculum love our students? How does school love our students? So then I want people to really start to do a study of the space. So looking at the external space and then also tending to the internal space. So a part of this work is really developing the critical cognitive capacities, the intellectual capacities of students. And I just have to mention my mentor, Zaretta Hammond, who has taught me so much. We brought her into the program that I was leading at Alameda County Office of Education, and she just changed the game completely for us. And so the focus really is how are we tending to the minds of children? Is that canned curriculum going to be the smartest thing to bring to a child? I think I've already made myself kind of clear where I stand on canned curriculum. Just because it gave me so much trauma. I do know that there's some good stuff there. So I just have to put a little caveat on it. So when we're building and focused on the intellectual capacities of students, what we also want to make sure is happening is that we're allowing the full capacity of students to do that in these beautiful ways. So not only brain-bound thinking, but what are the ways that we acquire knowledge? That is through the body. So how do we use movement, dance, gesture to help the brain encode information? How do we use music? How do we learn through the processes of the arts? And that's the trickiest part, is learning how to teach something through the processes of an art form, because then people go, what are you saying to me? And then we have to slow way down and say, yes, you can learn exponential numbers through an art practice. So there's in is the deeper study, which most of the book actually just does like the heavy groundwork just to get to that point, because it takes a lot of kind of rethinking of education and reframing what our roles are as educators.
I can see folks listening to this podcast seeing a connection between the arts and the humanities. How do you integrate art or performance or music into the sciences, into the maths? Could you give us an example of that?
I can give you an example of that. The first one I'm thinking of is the study of the rainforest, which is a study that I loved teaching. And this really took me into the place of how do I teach as a culturally responsive teacher through the arts. So in this unit, I focused on three goals. And my biggest goal was, what is the interdependency of the rainforest? So I wanted my students to really understand, how is the rainforest interdependent, but then taking that concept and making it about us. Like, how are we interdependent? So really getting that core concept down. And so we studied the layers of the rainforest. And in that study, it was all about recreating a rainforest in the classroom. So as we're learning, we're just building and making this rainforest happen in the
Nice.
so down to like the leaf cutter ants, they would cut out these little paper ants and put little leaves on them, build them in a little trail. This is after, like, this is while doing the research. So there are what the classroom looks like is lots of book study is happening. We're looking at pictures. We're doing sketches of these creatures, these animals, these insects. We're looking at what type, where in the rainforest are they? And then we're just building up like an architect would design, or like an artist would do like a scientific rendering. We're doing that, right? And then so we're building this thing up. And alongside, the portion of learning about a strangler fig was particularly interesting because we had a teaching artist at the time who actually went to the rainforest and did these beautiful dances inside strangler figs. And so
Mm.
he was able to support us in imagining that we were inside of a strangler fig and doing all of these various movements and gestures to compose being inside a strangler fig, and acting out like, how does a strangler fig grow, which is so beautiful. So my students really getting this full understanding. So they're seeing visuals of Oscar in the rainforest, so because it's all videotaped, his art piece. So they're getting to see what it actually looked like for him to be inside of this tree. And then so they have an active imagination about what it actually looks like, and they're able to then kind of put that into their bodies. That's one particular way. So another unit that I love is Andy West, who was a veteran teacher in Oakland, and he had this study about zombies when he was doing the exponential numbers, and he had a practice of zine making. So his students were making these zines to tell a story. In lies the best part about teaching and learning through the arts, is that our main way to teach and learn, our main way to learn actually as people, is through story. So he had students compose these incredible stories about zombies, and he said that he had never had a class learn exponential numbers so quickly in his life, 28 years of teaching, than he had when he applied the method of teaching through the art form. And it just says so much. Like, yeah, of course you're going to see more results because it is our primary way that we like to learn. So it's the construction of our brain that says that we gravitate towards story. That's how we really take in information. We like to move, like movement really helps those neurons to wire and fire together. The music, like John, those 5-year-olds are going to be out there
Yeah.
memorizing every word of a song, right?
Yeah. But
Uh,
too, Mariah, even on the higher end, like even high school. Now,
yes,
you're talking to someone who loved The Walking Dead.
yeah,
So
I
if
never watched it.
oh, it was a great show. Although I did kind of trail off by season 5. I
Okay.
really feel bad. I need to go back because people in my family would be talking about who survived. And I'm like, don't tell me, I'm going to
Yeah.
watch it. And they're like,
Yeah.
it's 7 years now. You're going to go back and watch it. But anyway, I digress. But what I love about that is I wish I had math teachers bringing in popular culture of the time in that way, right? Because maybe I would have been a stronger math student had I actually been more interested in the subject. Because like you, I come from more of a artistic background, but so that's brilliant actually thinking about it. So whereas maybe your rainforest experience or experiment or example is really good for, say, an elementary school or even a middle school, I like how even story can even be at the high school level. You can very easily be bringing in these stories, popular culture, to teach math concepts, to teach science concepts, particularly on the high school level. So loved hearing you say that, Mariah. And I also like the fact when I heard you talking about the dances of the jungle or the rainforest, excuse me, that's culturally relevant because that's not coming from a Western European background. So you're even bringing in more of a global education for our students. And that benefits not only students of color, that benefits students in the majority as population as well. With that in mind, Mariah, in general, if you were to walk into a classroom, you could pick the grade, the subject area. What are some things, like, I don't want to reduce it to a checklist, but just for the sake of our listeners, what are some things that you will see in a classroom that promotes lessons that love our kids?
Well, I think that when I walk into a classroom that is supporting students, I can actively see that there's love happening. What I'm actually assessing for is what we call the core four. So I'm looking for what sort of power dynamics, how are power dynamics managed and navigated? So power dynamics between students, between teacher student, power dynamics between, I'm going to say lineages because lineages is also a core four, but how are people being responsive to the structures that are in place? So there's a structure in place where we often give attention to the little white boy in the classroom that's cheeky and fun. But why? Like that is a design in play that is implicit bias, that we would give more attention to that child than, say, the little black girl in school that is quiet. So I'm looking for, has the teacher done the work to like understand why they might gravitate towards this little white child than their Black student? So that's a whole leg of work. And then I'm looking for narratives, like how are narratives showing up inside of the classroom space? So how is space being tended to from a visual stance? So there's research that tells us when you walk into a space, your body can pick up the patterns immediately and tell you if it's a safe space or not, before your conscious mind knows that it's a safe space or not. And so I think about when I walk into a space that is, I can walk into a space and I can tell if it is a space that is constructed for white bodies or if it's a space that's constructed for everybody. And when it's constructed for a particular body, that just kind of means, okay, I need to put some armor on here. Like I'm going to tighten up a little bit and I'm just maybe I am going to stay quiet. Some students are not going to feel comfortable speaking in places where they feel uncomfortable. So I'm looking for how are narratives honored and a part of full enmeshment of the study that's happening in the class. And then I'm looking for lineages. How are students' lineages present in space? So not just the flags that represent them, but a full immersion of how are they held as whole people in the space. It can be a lot trickier at first to understand how lineages show up in a classroom, but I'm even thinking about the placement of your classroom books. What books are visual upon walking in? Is it all of the Disney books? Or I want to ban Disney books from my classroom. Or is it some really beautiful works of art by a Middle Eastern author? Or it's like, how are you positioning things in the class that also tells a story of how you're respecting and holding the students in your classroom. And not only the students in your classroom, because sometimes those are pretty homogeneous. So you also have to respect that there are millions of people on this planet, and we want to be responding to not only who's represented in your classroom, but who are they going to be in song and dance with outside of the classroom, outside of the school world, because we are a diverse place. And then, okay, so then the last thing I want to say is embodiment. So I'm looking for, how is space constructed for students to learn in a full and embodied way? Meaning, is there space for students to access materials? Can their bodies kind of get up and move if they need to do some gesture work for a learning lesson? Things like that. I'm really looking for a sense of liberation inside of the classroom. Like, you can walk into a room and it can instantly feel clamored, or you can walk into a room and feel like, oh, this is for me to explore and I get to engage, and this feels so lovely. You can tell when students feel liberated in their own classroom space. So those are things I'm looking for.
I really liked how you simplified it into these 4 core practices, because what I often also like to ask my guest is, well, what can this look like in a classroom? So I think you already actually answered that. And I really liked how you were saying, is there space to move around? Is there space to explore? Also, what is front and center in terms of what is being recognized or honored? Which books? Where are those books positioned? Do we have a culture of reading in the classroom? Again, can students walk around? Can they show their learning through physical movement? Is there space to do that? Because you and I both know, Mariah, particularly in overpopulated schools, you could have a room that's completely covered from one end of the room to the other in desks that don't move. And talk about confining. How do you do any kind of multiple modality learning in that kind of a situation? So even if teachers can take what we're talking about, and even if they just think about how their classroom is set up, and if they could think about how to set their classrooms up to allow body movement, to prioritize different culture and different books, and has that culture of reading and exploration. Even just teachers thinking, is my classroom a room of exploration? Or is it a room where every eye is on me and my teaching? And whose room is this? Is this their room? Is this your room as the teacher? Is it our room? Just even getting going and thinking of those questions. I think if folks who listen to this episode, if they even get that, I would be happy that they start thinking about liberation even in that regard. So Mariah, what are some strategies that teachers can use to really do this liberation work?
I'm going to offer 2 strategies. One is a thinking protocol. So we know that thinking protocols support the development of the brain to think critically. They're so good for cognitive routines. And the one that we've created in our book that we love and teachers have been using and principals have been using for assessment as well is called the Love Protocol. And the Love Protocol is really something that you can use if you're analyzing student work yourself, if you want students to analyze their own work, or if you're a principal, you can do teacher evaluations using the Love Protocol, which we've seen, and it's been so amazing. First one is the L, and the L is for asking, what do you love about the said thing in front of you? So what do you love about your teaching practice? Or what do you love about this essay you just wrote, or whatever it is? What do you observe? So this is looking at what objective knowledge is there that you are looking at. What are the finer details that you see in the piece at hand? What observations at large are you making? And then what do you value? What is of value? So you probably have a student, this is very tricky for students. They create something and then they get stuck, or they want to throw it away because they're like, I didn't do a good job, particularly if they're doing art. What do you value about what you've just made? Like, there is something to value here. Can you see that and honor that? And then the final point is the E, which is how would you evolve or expand upon the ideas or the work that is here to look at. So this really pushes you to go further. So rather than getting in a stuck place that you're always looking for, yeah, there's learning is about constant expansion and evolving further. So getting a learner to identify where they would go next is a really great way to assess what they are thinking about and what knowledge they have on hand to go to that extra step. But it's also a place where you can weigh in and say, and offer some expertise around what and how it could evolve. And then the second is just in response to space that we talked about. And one thing that we do is we introduce the idea of alter with an ER and alter with an AR. And altering with an ER, I think I already explained, but alter with an AR is something that most cultures around the world participate in. When we allow an alter with an AR to happen in our classroom spaces, it's about bringing everybody's voice and lineage to the table. So if you asked me as a child, will you bring in a picture of your grandmother? My grandmother was the person that I loved so much. If I saw a picture of my grandmother sitting on an altar in my classroom, I would feel grounded every single day because I'm so connected to my grandmother. And the presence of her sitting in a classroom space, it just brings me to tears to think about. So we invite teachers to co-create an altar with their students and have students bring in an object of importance. And that object of importance tells you so much about who the child is. And it's a way that students can also introduce themselves for the beginning of the year by telling a story about their object of importance. And then teaching children how to collectively care for that space and honor each other. You can see everybody on a level playing field. Everyone's objects are in some arrangement. So altering with an AR is a very special thing. We want spaces to feel like a studio because what's happening in a studio, it's building the conditions for creativity. When you kind of reframe what is a classroom, what is it for? And so if we think about a classroom as a place that is really about building intellective capacity and making sure that the idea behind building intellective capacity is also about creativity and imagination. And then we have a space where students are really being activated to explore the way an artist might explore the world. So what an artist does is they have deep observation skills. They stretch and explore ideas. They engage and persist. They are reflecting constantly on ideas. So often teachers like to do that, are we doing metacognitive work? Like, yes. So artists are big on that. I love the idea of setting up and building the conditions. And in that, it can feel risky as a teacher to kind of redesign and rethink your space as such. But it's also what I've noticed, like a teacher a couple of weeks ago called me in. They were like, can you come and see my classroom? Because I want you to see what we've done. And so I went early one day to see her classroom, and she was so excited to show me. She had changed the classroom so that they had a pick of multiple art supplies. They had the art supplies were right next to the books. So they were able to kind of access the more intellective research component while being able to access all of the art component to support their research. It had changed her whole way of being. And this is, again, a veteran teacher. And the pride that she felt because she saw how activated her students became in this space. So she allowed them to get up and get the supplies that they needed. This is middle school. She said, she's like, my kids love it. And they love it to the point where they are taking care of the supplies. So they are very respectful because they know that they don't want it to go away. They're like, this is a good thing. I'm going to make sure, hey, as she said, a student asked if they could have more time and space to work on this art piece they were doing. And she said, sure. And so the student was like, I want to make sure that I'm not making too much noise for my neighbor that involves some etching or something. Like, how thoughtful for middle school. So to me, that is a culture and classroom of care and is responding to the learners in the most beautiful way.
Mariah, where can people find out more about you, Studio Pathways, your book? Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So where can folks connect with you?
Folks can connect with me at studiopathways.org. We hang out on Instagram mostly, but we're on Facebook. We have a community on our website that you can join for free right now. And we just started that. And we are going to be at various places. I think we're just starting to do our little tour of our book. So that's been really fun. And you can buy the book through Routledge Publishing or through Amazon.
Mariah, thank you so much for your time today. This was great.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.